The first time I can remember wanting to write was probably not until I was 17 or 18. And really it came from a generation of music journalists. There was a British music weekly, the New Musical Express, which launched a whole ton of really good writers who went on to do lots of interesting things. Some of them became notorious as well, but it taught me a lot about voice and people being opinionated and people drawing from other forms of culture to describe the music that they were listening to. And it was one of the first times I think that writing made much sense to me. In my first book, Fever Pitch was a memoir and a work of non-fiction, but I did have aspirations to write fiction, and in fact before Fever Pitch I'd tried to write scripts, but I didn't know what they were and I didn't know what form a script took, but they were fictional, these scripts. Funnily enough, I was invited to speak to an agent who'd seen some of my journalism and asked me to come in for a chat about a book. And I went in talking about high fidelity, really. It wasn't in the form that it was in, but it was about music and about relationships. And I could see her eyes glazing over. And I thought, yeah, well, you know, it's not really a book until I've written it. There's nothing to say about it. And I thought, I'm losing her attention. And I'd had the idea of Fever Pitch, but I'd decided that this woman was, well, she was very posh, and I thought she's not going to be interested in the football book. But when I could see that my time was coming to an end, I suddenly started talking about Fever Pitch. And to my surprise, she said, that I can sell. And I thought, really? And she was right, she did. And I would say that those two books represent the 3 years I spent at university, where I didn't do any studying at all, but I watched a lot of football, talked a lot of football, and listened to and bought music constantly. And I think I became aware when I was at university that there was something in me that needed to consume everything. Books, movies, music, sport, art. I just always want something going in, and it comes out somehow. That is my petrol, and I'm passionately interested in how these things are made, and almost more interested in why people are not consuming things that mean a lot, not only to me, but I know would mean a lot to them. So I get a bit depressed when people use culture as a kind of pacifier. Watching or listening just because they have nothing to do at that particular moment in time. They don't think that the experience is going to be transformative, or they don't hope for anything inspirational. And yet I firmly believe that is capable of happening. Inspiration and transformation is capable of happening at any moment during a day if you find the right thing to read or the right thing to listen to. So we're constantly on the edge of being surprised and changed by something, but we have to dig a little bit to find what it is that's going to mean that much to us. When I've written about reading, I always say to people, if it's not enthralling, stop reading it, because it's not for you. That book is not for you. It doesn't matter that if it's a great book. It doesn't matter if you think you should be reading a great book and not this book. If this book is making sense to you, read it. Because I always imagine that we have these sockets in our back that are really complicated, you know, like the old ports for computers. And you have to find the things that are going to fit. And when it fits, then you become electrified by it. But if it doesn't fit, then culture becomes very samey and a bit of a trudge, I think. I don't think I have an awful lot of trouble with ideas. I don't know why. I think maybe part of a writer's job is to think of ideas anyway. And I'm just coming to a stage in my life where I realise that I will die without having completed the ideas that I have, which is a rather difficult realisation because, first of all, it means there will be no retirement. And secondly, I know I will be left with the feeling of a life uncompleted. I will probably die in the middle of something. But they're all backed up. There are things that I want to do that are coming up, and as a consequence, because they're backed up, I don't need to look for inspiration. The inspiration has already happened some time before, and now it's waiting its place in a queue. I think when I have the ideas and I walk around them a little bit, and I always think of it as jumping on them, like, you know, you would stand on a chair to see if it's going to take your weight. And sometimes they collapse. Sometimes you realise that they were someone else's idea some time ago, and you're just looking at it from a different angle. But sometimes they're steady, and then I walk around and around them and I think, oh, I would love to see this, but see it on a screen. Or I think this cannot be contained within the pages of a novel. Maybe it's something longer, cut into parts, like a TV series. The songwriting I'd never done before until my friend Ben Folds suggested that we write songs together. And then that was really weird because then everything was a song. Every idea I had, the ideas were small, and I thought, oh, that's a page of lyrics. But I started to look at the world in that way while I was looking for that material, I think. So there's a mix of finding inspiration, but also knowing what you need the inspiration for. I suspect that in the future there will be only writers. There won't be novelists or screenwriters or poets or whatever. That writers are going to have to do all things. And you're just going to have to get used to the idea that there is not going to be a complete living in books, certainly not in plays or poetry. It's probably going to be television for the time being, I think, for most people. But if you look at, you know, even the 20th century, the 30s was a big time for poetry in England. The 50s was a theatrical revolution, and that attracted the talent. It's very hard to see anyone now thinking, right, I'm going to be a playwright, because it's very hard to see what kind of career that could be if you're starting as a playwright now. And specifically, once I do start writing different media, then each thing feeds into the other. I've become less embarrassed about using dialogue so much in fiction. I just think, well, why not? You know, it's still a book, even if they're talking to each other. And it's taught me a lot about editing and where the big scene is in a book or you know, in a movie. You can't write 5-10 page scenes. You can only do that a couple of times, and they're 3 pages, not 5 pages. In a book, you can go on a lot longer, but you still have the idea that just because you can write something doesn't mean you should. If you look at something like High Fidelity, it's really set inside someone's head, inside a record shop, and you would say that that's the least cinematic thing that you could possibly come up with. And in fact, when they made the movie, you know, that's pretty much where it stayed. And John Cusack's Rob, his thoughts come directly to us. He breaks the fourth wall. I think what happens is that there are characters in the book, there are jokes in the book, and there are situations in the book, and they lend themselves to filmmaking. And then people buy the rights and think, oh, now what do we do? What the hell are we supposed to do with this? But I think the important thing is that they connect with people emotionally, and if those people happen to work in cinema, then they'll think, okay, now I want to make this into something that I can do. I mean, it's happened with theatre as well, one-man shows and all sorts. So I don't think there's anything cinematic necessarily in the books. And of course, writing pages of dialogue doesn't help a filmmaker at all, because they're taking place in a room and they need to break that action up and they need to get it out of that room and into another room. Or we always talk about books being turned into films, but of course they're not turned into anything. They just sit there being books. And if a film is successful, people might read the book. If a film is unsuccessful, people don't even know it was ever made in the first place. I think every writer who has written a book that somebody wants to adapt starts off by thinking, right, I'm going to control this process because I want it to be really good. So that's, if you know a lot about directors and a lot about actors, you still won't know enough. And then what do you know about editing? What do you know about score composing? What do you know about lighting? And these people all earn lots of money because they're experts, and any one of them can ruin your film. Producers can ruin your film. Everyone can ruin your film. You can ruin your film yourself with your script. So what you learn is that it's slightly miraculous if everybody is at the top of their game at the same time. And I think that's happened to me a couple of times, and it's been a thrilling experience, but you can't expect it to happen that often. As I've got older, and I've made this realization that I am a super consumer, as it were, then I don't feel guilty about anything, because I know it's what I need to create. So TV, I'm a huge TV watcher. Obviously, we all were during the pandemic, but I think TV is where some of the best writing is being done. You know, I suppose everyone uses the same examples, but The Wire and The Sopranos, they're like Dickens novels, and you're not slumming it watching these things. That's proper work. It doesn't even really feel like popular culture anymore. I think the term popular culture is becoming a bit outdated. There is really not the distinction between what David Simon did with The Wire and what Julian Barnes is doing in fiction. I think they're both thinking very hard about how to say things about the world, and that's something new in television. Well, the whole thing about popular and literary doesn't mean anything to me. I noticed my career for a time was different in England and America, and the difference was that in America, Fever Pitch was not a success because they don't watch that sport. So effectively, my first book was High Fidelity, and it started in a culty way, and High Fidelity, I think, was a modern literary novel when it was published in America. But in England, because I'd already written Fever Pitch then, and High Fidelity was a bestseller, then it wasn't a literary novel. And you think, okay, it's nothing to do with anything. It's just perception, numbers, prizes to a certain extent. None of it means anything. I think answering a question about who has been permanently influential is difficult, because you change, they change, the artists change. I mean, if you're consuming someone during their lifetime, they might go in a direction that you can no longer follow, or they're not going in any different direction and you've had too much of the same thing up till that point. So there are people I've always loved, and I mean, Dickens is a big person for me, and I think that will remain the same. Anne Tyler was a huge inspiration to me when I started writing. I think the first time I saw Springsteen literally changed my life, in that afterwards I knew I couldn't have a normal life, that I couldn't just go to work and then listen to music in the evening, that I had to get to as close as I could to that experience of creating that music on stage. So yeah, there's a few people that remain important.